testimony, a great deal of it, about the coordination that took place during the Millennium Threat in 1999, where there were a series of principals meetings and a lot of activity, as we're told, which stopped and prevented incidents. It was a success. It was an intelligence success. And there had to be domestic coordination with foreign intelligence and everything. But it seemed to work. The time ended, the threat ended, and apparently the guard was let down a little too as the threat diminished. Now, we've also heard testimony about what we would call the summer threat, the spike threat, whatever it is, of 2001. A lot of chatter. You shared some of it with us directly. A lot of traffic and a lot of threats. And during that period, actually, to put it in context, I guess it was the first draft of the NSPD was circulated to deputies. But right then, when that was happening, the threats were coming in, and it's been described as a crescendo and hair on fire and all these different things. At that time, the CSG handled the alert, if you will. And we've heard testimony about Clark warning you and the NSC that state and CIA and the Pentagon had concerns, and were convinced there was going to be a major terrorist attack. And on July 5th, I believe it was, domestic agencies, including the FBI and the FAA, were briefed by the White House. Alerts were issued. The next day, the CIA told the CSG participants, and I think they said they believed their upcoming attack would be as spectacular, something quantitatively different from anything that had been done to date. So everybody was worried about it. Everybody was concentrating on it. And then later the crescendo ended, and again it abated. But of course, that time, the end of the story wasn't pleasant. Now, during this period of time, I'd like you to just respond to several points. What involvement did you have in this alert? And how did it come about that the CSG was handling this thing as opposed to the principals? Because candidly, it has been suggested that the difference between the 1999 handling and this one was that you didn't have the principals dealing with it, therefore it wasn't given the priority, therefore the people weren't forced to do what they would otherwise have done, et cetera. You've heard the same things I've heard. And would it have made a real difference in enhancing the exchange of intelligence, for instance, if it had been the principals? I would like your comments both on your involvement and your comment to that question. Thank you. Of course.
Let me start by talking about what we were doing in the structure we used. I've mentioned that the CSG, yes, was the counterterrorism group, was the nerve center, if you will. And that's been true through all crises. I think it was, in fact, a nerve center as well during the millennium, that they were the counterterrorism experts. They were able to get together. They got together frequently. They came up with taskings that needed to be done. I would say that if you look at the list of taskings that they came up with, it reflected the fact that the threat information was from abroad. It was that the agencies, like the Department of State, needed to make clear to Americans traveling abroad that there was a danger, that embassies needed to be on alert, that our force protection needed to be strong for our military forces. The Central Intelligence Agency was asked to do some things. It was very foreign policy or foreign threat-based as well. And of course, the warning to the FBI to go out and task their field agents. The CSG was made up of not junior people, but the top level of counterterrorism experts. Now, they were in contact with their principals. Dick Clark was in contact with me quite frequently during this period of time. When the CSG would meet, he would come back, usually through email, sometimes personally, and say, here's what we've done. I would talk every day, several times a day, with George Tenet about what the threat spike looked like. In fact, George Tenet was meeting with the president during this period of time, so the president was hearing directly about what was being done about the threats to the only really specific threats we had, to Genoa, to the Persian Gulf. There was one to Israel. So the president was hearing what was being done. the CSG was the nerve center. But I just don't believe that bringing the principals over to the White House every day and having their counterterrorism people have to come with them and be pulled away from what they were doing to disrupt was a good way to go about this. It wasn't an efficient way to go about it. I talked to Powell, I talked to Rumsfeld about what was happening with the threats and with the alerts. I talked to George. I asked that the Attorney General be briefed because even though there were no domestic threats, I didn't want him to be without that briefing. It's also the case that I think if you actually look back at the Millennium period, it's questionable to me whether the argument that has been made that somehow shaking the trees is what broke up the Millennium period is actually accurate. And I was not there, clearly, but I will tell you this, I will say this, that the Millennium, of course, was a period of high threat by its very nature. We all knew that the Millennium was a period of high threat. And after September 11th, Dick Clark sent us the after-action report that had been done after the Millennium plot. And their assessment was that Rassam had been caught by chance. Well, Rassam being the person who was entering the United States over the Canadian border with bomb-making materials in store. I think it actually wasn't by chance, which was Washington's view of it. It was because a very alert customs agent named Diana Dean and her colleagues sniffed something about Rassam. They saw that something was wrong. They tried to apprehend him. He tried to run. They then apprehended him, found that there was bomb-making material and a map of Los Angeles. Now, at that point, you have pretty clear indication that you've got a problem inside the United States. I don't think it was shaking the trees that produced the breakthrough in the Millennium plot. It was that you got a, Dick Clark would say a lucky break. I would say you got an alert customs agent who got it right. And the interesting thing is that I've checked with customs, and according to their records, they weren't actually on alert at that point. So I just don't buy the argument that we weren't shaking the trees enough and that something was going to fall out that gave us somehow that little piece of information that would have led to connecting all of those dots. In any case, you cannot be dependent on the chance that something might come together. That's why the structural reforms are important. And the President of the United States had us at battle stations during this period of time. He expected his Secretary of State to be locking down embassies. He expected his Secretary of Defense to be providing force protection. He expected his FBI director to be tasking his agents and getting people out there. He expected his Director of Central Intelligence to be out and doing what needed to be done in terms of disruption. And he expected his National Security Advisor to be looking to see that, or talking to people to see that that was done. But I think we've created a kind of false impression, or a not quite correct impression of how one does this in a threat period. I might just add that during the China period, the 11 days of the China crisis, I also didn't have a principals meeting.
Thank you, Dr. Rice.
Most intelligence community officials operating overseas coordinate liaison relationships well with the DCI representatives who are responsible for intelligence relations with foreign governments. U.S. ambassadors are always briefed, according to the chief of the CIA's blank. He emphasized that the primary instruction given to the DCI representative by CIA is recruit the U.S. ambassador first. That is, gain the goodwill of the ambassador. Interviews with several ambassadors indicate that, in general, the intelligence community coordinates well with U.S. embassies. Nonetheless, there are challenges to coordinating relations with liaison services. For instance, liaison on counterterrorism has not always been integrated into overall U.S. regional goals. Senior policymakers told the Joint Inquiry that before September 11th, they had not always succeeded in incorporating the struggle against al-Qaeda into U.S. policy towards key states. As a result, other issues often diverted attention from terrorism. There are also many channels through different agencies for U.S. government liaison with foreign governments. These range from CIA and FBI to the Agriculture and Commerce departments. As former National Security Advisor Sandy Berger noted, U.S. ambassadors often lack control over these relationships, and, consequently, the U.S. government does not always properly consider the priorities of all the requests it makes of foreign governments. Richard Clark also notes that there exists a gentleman's agreement with friendly liaison services that you don't spy in the United States and we don't spy in your country. In his view, however, this arrangement could put the United States at some disadvantage when foreign liaison services are not terribly aggressive on our behalf. This disadvantage was compounded by the decision at the end of the Cold War to cut CIA presence in some Western countries dramatically. CIA is responsible for coordinating the overall intelligence liaison relationship, but FBI legats and Defense Department attachés do not need CIA permission to interact with their local partners when, for example, a U.S. citizen overseas is involved in terrorism. Weaknesses in interagency coordination overseas can often reflect lack of coordination within the United States. For example, during joint inquiry interviews abroad, it was determined at a joint planning meeting to target al-Qaeda leader blank, which was led to conclude CIA officers and their foreign liaison services counterparts that they did not include the local FBI legat. In fact, he was not aware of the meeting, though the Bureau plays a major role in tracking blank. In general, however, CIA and FBI have come to learn about more each other's procedures and requirements, and as a result, have improved cooperation overseas.